Near the dry edge of the Namib Desert, just past midday, a lion cub appeared where none should have. It came from the open flatlands beyond the fence line, crawling more than walking, its ribs sharp under dust-matted fur. Its front paws trembled with each pull forward. Its back legs barely moved at all. There was no sound, not even the faint cry a healthy cub might make, just the scrape of bone against sand, and a body trying not to stop. Ranger Emil was the first to notice. He had been repairing a water pipe near the perimeter when he looked up, blinked once, then again. He stood slowly, setting his tools down without thought. A few meters away, the rest of the camp went quiet too. The low murmur of radio chatter and clinking tools falling silent as more rangers turned to face the same direction. No one moved at first. Then Emil stepped forward and said only, "Lena, get the sheet." It wasn't a command, just the truth. The cub collapsed before reaching the edge of the shade cloth. Its chest rose shallowly, its eyes half closed but unfocused. The body was no larger than a small dog, its tail limp behind it, patchy and raw. It had been moving without direction for hours, maybe days, and now it had made it as far as the scent of people, or perhaps water, had carried it. Lena returned with an old cotton sheet used for handling injured animals. She knelt beside the cub, her hands hovering. The others stood back. The cub didn't flinch when she touched its side. Its skin was hot under the dust. There was no blood, no visible wounds, just skeletal thinness and a mouth too dry to open. They had seen lions like this before, in severe droughts or when separated from their pride too long, but never this close to camp. Never one who walked alone into human space. "We need to lift him," Lena said softly. Emil nodded. They worked together, slipping the fabric under the cub's belly. It was so light, too light. As they moved him, a soft grunt escaped the cub's throat. Not pain exactly, just the startled protest of being touched after too long alone. They placed him under the shade roof, away from direct sun, and dripped water onto a rolled cloth. Lena pressed the damp edge gently to the cub's mouth. At first, nothing happened. Then a flick of his tongue, just once. Around them, the others watched but did not speak. Every motion stayed slow. Every hand stayed low. There was no rush, not because there wasn't danger, but because rushing would only make it worse. If they moved too fast, the cub's heart could give out. If they did too little, he would fade. By late afternoon, the cub had not moved again. His body remained curled, breaths shallow and spaced. The water had dampened his nose, but not much else. Lena stayed beside him, crouched low with her back against a stone crate. She didn't touch him again. Just wait. Sometimes animals needed time to decide. The heat held across the plain. Beyond the camp, the sand shimmered. Birds moved in short, low flights, and even the beetles dug down to avoid the surface. This was a place for animals built to endure, not for the very young or the very weak. The cub should not have lasted this long, and still, somehow, he had arrived. By early evening, Emil returned with a shallow dish of water, setting it nearby. The cub didn't move toward it. His ears stayed flat, tail still. A lizard skittered near the base of a post. Somewhere in the distance, a vulture turned. The world remained indifferent. "We wait till morning," Emil said, his voice just above a whisper. Lena nodded, not looking away from the cub. She had seen animals die in silence before, some overnight, some in the heat of day, but she had also seen strange things. A jackal that stood after 3 still days, a zebra foal that limped into its mother's shadow and healed. Not miracles, just persistence. That night they set a lantern a few feet from the shade, not bright, just enough to see the outline of the cub's frame. The other rangers took shifts, watching quietly. No one disturbed him. A single line had been crossed when the cub entered the camp. The rest belonged to him now. The wind came up after dark, slow and dry. Dust curled against the cloth edge, the same color as the cub's fur. He didn't wake, he didn't shift, but he breathed. And that, for now, was enough. By first light, the air inside the ranger shelter held a quiet that felt heavier than sleep. The cub had not moved during the night. His body, curled into itself beneath the canvas awning, stayed as it had been, motionless except for the small pull of breath beneath his ribs. When Lena knelt beside him again, her hands hovered once more before settling gently at his side. There was no flinch, no twitch, no effort to rise. His skin was warm. That was all. They lifted him just after sunrise. 2 rangers moved in slow coordination, Lena at the front, Emil at the rear. The old canvas sheet cradled the cub's thin frame as they passed through the outer gate and into the shaded interior of the medical stall. There was no resistance. His head hung limp from the side. His eyes opened halfway as they moved, but didn't follow the motion. No recognition, just dull reflection. They laid him down on a padded mat, soft enough not to press against bone. The floor had been cooled with poured water and covered in dry cloth. A shallow bowl of clean water stood near the edge, beside gauze, a syringe without a needle, and strips of soaked linen. Lena sat cross-legged near the cub's head. She dipped the cloth again and held it gently to his lips. Nothing. She waited, counted to 10. Then again. This time, there was the smallest movement. Not a lick, not even a full shift. But the tip of his tongue brushed the edge of the wet fabric. Again, she said softly. She didn't expect a response. The room was quiet, but not sterile. Dust filtered through the screen at the high window. The camp's generator clicked once in the far distance, then stilled again. Outside, birds made short, quick calls. Insects tapped against the mesh. The cub remained still, legs folded unnaturally beneath him. His paws twitched occasionally, but not in pain. They looked like the final remnants of exhausted instinct, the body replaying an earlier run, an earlier fight to reach the humans. His breathing was shallow, but not worsening. They marked each hour by that one truth. He had not stopped. By mid-morning, Lena had managed to coax a few more drops of water into his mouth. It was not enough, but it was something. She cleaned the dust from around his eyes with soft cotton, rinsed and cooled. She used a single wet finger to trace near the base of his ears, brushing the knots of dried mud and fur. At one point, she paused, listening. She thought she heard a faint sound from his throat. A whimper, or maybe just the rough pull of air trying to deepen. But it was brief, then gone. They hadn't given him a name. That wasn't their way. Names came after survival. Or sometimes never. But Lena had started thinking of him in shape and color. A pale outline, half-shadowed, the way dry leaves press against riverbanks. He was small, but not newly born. Old enough to have walked far, young enough that he should not have been alone. Emil returned at intervals. Quiet each time. He checked the temperature, noted the cub's weight. No improvement. He kept his words simple. Still too quiet. No interest in sound. Refuse the milk. Lena nodded each time. The others came and went as needed, clearing space, adjusting shade panels, preparing another station just in case he made it through the day. No one used hopeful language. That was another quiet rule. Hope came later, if it came at all. Around noon, the wind shifted slightly. The air grew warmer inside the shelter. Flies appeared but didn't settle. Lena had kept his fur wiped and damp. His nose, cracked earlier, looked slightly darker now. Not wet, but less pale. A small change. She whispered again, just a little more. Not a plea. Just an offering. Outside, life continued. Tracks showed the passing of a solitary giraffe at dawn. A distant herd of zebras kept to the flats. No lions had been seen or heard in the surrounding kilometers for over a week. That was what made the cub's appearance so strange. He had come from somewhere, but no one knew from where, or why, or how far he had walked. Mid-afternoon settled like a pause. Heat shimmered against the mesh. One of the older rangers stepped in briefly and left a cloth bag of rehydration salts by the door. Lena didn't call out. She didn't want to make the cub flinch. Though he hadn't moved in hours, she kept everything slow. Calm movements, quiet hands, soft breath. When the light began to bend long through the side of the shelter, the cub stirred. It wasn't a movement of strength, more a soft recoil. One paw slid an inch forward, claws curled inward. Lena froze. His ears twitched, ever so slightly. Then his nose shifted toward the damp cloth she had set nearby. That was the first clear response, a sign of presence, of awareness. She dipped the gauze again, twisted it softly to release just a drop, and held it steady. The cub's tongue flicked toward it. The second flick came sooner. Then again. His eyes didn't open, but he was reaching now. Not much, but enough. The other rangers said nothing. One watched from the doorway, arms crossed. Another stood outside the screen, gaze low. They had all seen animals on this edge, teetering between the pull to continue and the peace of letting go. This cub was close to both, but tonight there was still breath. At dusk, Lena laid another cloth across his body, thin but warmed by her hands. The air cooled quickly after sunset. She touched his side once more. The rhythm of breath was there, shallow, uneven, but present. She stayed near him as the others prepared for evening rotation. She didn't say she would keep watch. She just didn't move. If he stirred by nightfall, the next stage could begin. If not, his heart might slow too far, and there would be no bringing it back. That was the quiet balance they lived with each time. One breath, then another, or not. Lena closed her eyes for a moment, listening. Outside, dry grass scratched against the shelter wall. A single nightjar called in the distance. The cub's side rose again, then paused. Then rose once more. That was all. For now, it was enough. The morning light came thin and colorless, seeping in over the ridge and resting against the wire perimeter of the shelter. The cub was still breathing, barely. His body hadn't moved much during the night, but when Lena pressed a damp cloth to his lips at first light, he responded. A soft flick of the tongue, slower than before, but present. His ears twitched once at a fly, though his eyes stayed closed. That was the only motion until Emil entered with news. "There are prints," he said, voice low. Lena looked up. Emil didn't move closer. He stood near the open doorway, one hand resting against the wooden frame. "West fence, past the ridgeline. They're fresh." "How big?" she asked. "Too big to be his," Emil replied. By the time Lena stepped outside, the sun had lifted just enough to warm the dry stone around the edges of the camp. Emil walked beside her without speaking. The others were already gathered along the west path, crouched low. Tracks curved around the outer fence, 4 of them, each one deeper than the dry soil beneath should allow. The pads were wide. The spacing told a story. One lion, heavy-bodied, circling. The prints trailed off toward the hills, then came back, then stopped. "She stood here," one of the rangers said. He pointed to a shallow depression in the dust. All 4 paused for a while, then nothing. They all knew what that could mean. A scout, a mother, a lioness searching and waiting, then moving on again. But it didn't make sense. This far into human activity, so close to sound and scent and light, most lions kept to the deeper brushland or higher outcrops. No prides had been tracked this close in months. Lena followed the prints to the edge where the camp shadows ended. Her boots disturbed nothing. The wind hadn't yet pulled the dust away. She knelt down and studied the direction. The paws had faced inward toward the camp, not just in passing, but fixed, as if whoever had left them had been still, watching. Back inside the shelter, the cub's breathing slowed during the late morning heat. Lena returned to him after the prints were recorded. His tongue was too dry again, but his ears still twitched from time to time. She pressed her hand to his chest. The rhythm was faint, but even. She whispered, "She was here." Not for him, just to say it. In the hours that followed, they stayed alert. One ranger kept to the fence line, scanning the flat horizon. Another climbed the low platform that overlooked the shallow ravine leading into the southern scrub. They saw little. Birds overhead, the passing shadow of a jackal along the outer rocks, nothing more. Until mid-afternoon, when the heat pressed the camp into stillness, and a call came from the edge of the fence. "Something's out there," the voice said. Emil and Lena stepped into the glare. On the far side of the open flat, at least 40 meters out, a lioness stood, still as stone, her body outlined against the gray dust. She did not move forward. She did not pace. Her head was low but alert. She had seen the humans. She had chosen not to flee. She was thin. Her ribs showed clearly under her coat. Her shoulders were narrow, and there was a patch of missing fur along her side, like an old scrape healing without care. Her tail curled slightly at the tip, and her eyes held to the camp. "She's alone," someone said. But no one else answered. The lioness took one step forward, then stopped. Her breathing could not be seen at this distance, but the stillness around her was heavy. She didn't roar. She didn't crouch. Just stood there, legs steady beneath her. "She's looking for something," Emil said. They all understood what he meant. If the cub inside was hers, if they had been separated in some unknown way, then perhaps she had been searching. Or perhaps not. There were too many unknowns. But still, she stood. Lena took a slow step toward the edge of the fence, then knelt. She didn't wave. She didn't speak, just made herself smaller. She kept her eyes low. The lioness did not react. She didn't retreat or advance. She watched. Then, after several long minutes, she turned her head slightly, not toward the hills, not away from the camp, just enough to let the wind move past her face, and then she sat. That was all. No warning call, no bluff charge, no motion to leave. She simply lowered herself to the ground, back legs folded neatly under her frame, tail resting along the dust. Inside the shelter, the cub stirred. His legs shifted, uncoordinated. His back paw kicked once. Lena didn't see it, but later she would remember the timing. The lioness remained at her post until the light began to fade. Then she stood, turned slowly, and disappeared into the brush. Not quickly, not afraid, just gone. That night, they moved the cub's resting space closer to the back door. Not outside, but near to open air, just in case. No one said what they were thinking. But every ranger that night kept their watchful eyes turned west. The heat lifted just slightly by late afternoon, as though the land itself had exhaled after holding its breath all day. Inside the shelter, the cub lay as before, thin and still tucked under the edge of a shade cloth. But there was a difference now. His ribs rose more sharply, the spaces between them drawing deeper with each breath. His nostrils flared, slow but definite. Lena noticed it first. She had been sitting with her back against the wall, rubbing condensation from a glass bottle, when she saw the change. She moved closer, crouched low, and placed her palm gently beside his chest. The rise and fall of his body was stronger now, no longer the barely there rhythm of a fading animal. This was something else. Effort, strain. His paws twitched more frequently, and once his back leg slid against the canvas with a soft scrape. Lena stayed still. She didn't speak. She let him move as he could. Behind the shelter, Emil paced the western edge of the camp. They had spoken little since the lioness appeared the day before. No more tracks had been found that morning. No fresh scat or markings, no sounds. But no one believed she had gone far. Just before dusk, a call came from the lookout post. Not loud, but steady. Emil stepped up to the rise and looked toward the brush where the plains broke into scattered low trees. There, in the golden light, stood the lioness again. She hadn't changed. Her frame was still thin, but her posture was calm. She stood with the same stillness as before, body angled toward the shelter. A long moment passed. Then she moved, slowly, one step at a time, down the ridge and across the dusted ground. Inside, Lena turned to the sound of the gate alert and rose to look through the mesh. She didn't need to be told. She stepped aside and opened the outer flap wider, letting the warm light pool near the cub. The lioness moved with deliberate weight, not stalking, not charging, just walking. Her shoulders rolled gently with each step, head low but not in warning. When she reached the outer edge of the camp's fencing, she stopped. Her body remained loose. Her tail didn't lash. She made no sound. She stood and stared into the shelter. The cub shifted again. It was not dramatic, just the slow lift of his head, as if drawn by something beyond scent or sound. His eyes opened, not fully, but enough. His nose tilted upward, then down, toward the open flap. He blinked, and the corner of his mouth twitched. Lena dropped to her knees. The cub pushed his front paws forward, sliding his body a few inches across the canvas. His claws scraped weakly at the mat, and for the first time he lifted his weight. Not far, not fully, but enough to lift his chest off the ground. His legs trembled, unsure, and gave way. He fell again, softly, but he didn't stop trying. One paw stretched outward, reaching past the edge of the shade line. His breathing came harder now, almost too hard, and Lena reached quickly for the gauze again. She pressed it to his lips, and this time, he bit it gently. "Hold it there." Outside the mesh, the lioness didn't blink. She took one step closer, then another. She reached the edge of the enclosure's outer wall and lowered her body into a crouch, resting her haunches against the earth. She didn't growl, didn't paw the ground. She simply watched. The air between them felt charged, not with fear but with something quiet and steady. Recognition, maybe, or just proximity. A moment without threat. Emil stood near the gate, arms still. No one spoke. The cub's breathing leveled after a few minutes, stronger now. Still labored, but less erratic. His body settled back onto the mat, front legs folded, head resting against one paw. He kept his eyes on the light outside the door. They didn't drift shut. The lioness remained there, unmoving. The wind pushed soft dust between her paws. She turned her head once, scanning the brush behind her, then faced the shelter again. Her ears flicked at a sound only she could hear, but her body didn't shift. Night gathered slowly over the camp. The first stars appeared above the distant trees. Emil lit the low lanterns along the walkway, careful to keep the closest ones dimmed. Lena laid another cloth beside the cub, this one warm from her hands, and adjusted the mat so his legs could stretch comfortably. He didn't sleep, but he no longer shook. As the last of the daylight slipped behind the ridge, the lioness rose. She stood for a long moment, head turned toward the shelter's opening. Then, without sound, she walked back toward the brush, her tail low, her steps slow. She didn't look back. Inside, the cub's eyes stayed open. His nostrils moved gently. He had seen her. That much was certain. And when she came again, if she came again, he would be stronger. The wind softened just before dawn. It moved low along the ground, lifting dust in thin veils that never quite reached the camp. The sky held the first gray light of morning, enough to cast long shadows through the open shelter flap. Lena was already awake. She hadn't slept. Not really. The cub had stirred often in the night, shifting his legs, lifting his head, blinking toward the doorway as if waiting for something he didn't fully understand. This time, they left the door open. The decision wasn't spoken aloud. It had been made in glances, between Lena and Emil, between the rangers keeping silent watch through the dark. No one had seen the lioness return during the night, but no one doubted she was close. The feeling settled over the camp like a scent, quiet, certain, real. The cub had improved. Not enough to stand for long, not enough to cry out, but enough to pull himself forward slightly, enough to keep his eyes fixed on the wind's direction. His body was still fragile, ribs still visible, movements still slow, but he hadn't gone backwards, and that, here, meant everything. Emil made his rounds quietly. Water was checked. Fence lines confirmed. The lookout rotated without a word. Lena stayed in the shelter, kneeling beside the cub, brushing dust from his face. His breath was warm against her hand now. His ears twitched more often. Once he pressed his paw against the mat and lifted his head fully just for a moment. It happened just as the sun touched the edge of the ridge. A figure moved beyond the low trees. Not fast, not uncertain. The lioness emerged from the same direction as before, her body catching the gold of first light. She did not pause. She did not circle. She walked straight toward the camp, her path steady, her eyes fixed on the shelter's opening. No one stopped her. There was no need. This was not aggression, not hunger. It was returned. Her body passed the outer fence line and reached the door. She lowered her head and stepped through, one slow footfall at a time. She crossed the threshold of the shelter with the ease of something long known, as though she had always known this path, even when she hadn't walked it. Lena stepped back, lowering herself to the far wall. She kept her breath quiet, kept her hands still. The lioness didn't look at her. She moved to the cub's side and lay down beside him without a sound. Her ribs pressed against the mat, her flank lined against his. For a moment, neither moved. Then she bent her neck, slowly, and licked him once along the back of the head. Then again, softer. The cub let out a low grunt, not fear, not pain, but something closer to relief. His paw shifted, trembling, and touched her chest. No one spoke. Outside, the other rangers had gathered in silence. Emil stood just beyond the entrance, still as the fence posts. No one moved toward the shelter. They only watched. The lioness adjusted her body and curled slightly around the cub, her tail wrapping loosely beside his legs. She didn't lick again. She didn't press. She just remained there, her body quiet and calm. Lena felt something inside her chest unclench. She couldn't name it. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't a victory. It was smaller than that and deeper. The kind of emotion that came only when something broken had quietly come back into place. The cub began to breathe more evenly. His eyes closed for a time, then it opened again. His side rose and fell against her belly. His paw stayed near her chest. He didn't cry out. He didn't shift away. She hadn't abandoned him. Not like some feared. She had been searching, circling the outer boundaries, calling in her own way, trying to follow what was left of his scent. Maybe she had watched them from a distance. Maybe she had known he was near and simply waited for the right moment to return. Whatever the truth, she was here now, and he was still alive. The light changed as the sun climbed. Inside the shelter, the air grew warmer, the shadows shorter. The lioness blinked slowly. Once she lifted her head to glance toward the open flap. Then she lowered it again and pressed her muzzle gently against the cub's side. Lena backed out of the shelter slowly. Emil met her just beyond the door. She looked up at him, her face marked by the dust and the hours. He didn't say anything, just nodded once. They both knew what came next. They would give them time. No intervention, no noise, no unnecessary presence. The team would keep their distance now, watching from the edge, letting the moment belong to the two that needed it. Inside the shelter, the cub slept lightly, his breath shallow but steady. The lioness did not leave his side, not for food, not for water. She simply remained, her body curved protectively, not in fear, but in instinct. The camp fell quiet again. For the first time in days, it felt like stillness instead of tension. There was nothing else to ask for now. The choice had been made. The path was shared again. The light through the open flap spilled gently across the canvas, catching on the fine dust, the outline of two bodies pressed together. One weak, one worn. Both alive. By late afternoon, the shelter stood quiet, the fabric walls stirring gently with the rising wind. Inside, the cub had begun to move with more certainty. His steps were short and scattered, but he could rise now without collapsing. He paused often, his breathing still uneven, but he no longer needed help to cross the length of the mat. The lioness watched him closely, her eyes following each motion, her body remaining low and calm. She didn't guide him. She didn't push. She simply waited. The decision came without discussion. Emil stepped into the shelter just before the sky began to shift gold. He stood at the edge, hands loose at his sides, and met Lena's eyes. She nodded. They both knew what needed to happen next. The cub could not stay here. He would not survive long in captivity, not even a temporary one, and she would not leave without him. The back gate was unlatched slowly. The path beyond led toward the low grasses that opened into the western ridge, far from the road, far from human noise. The sun hung just above the horizon, casting long lines across the shelter floor. Lena stood to the side and pulled back the canvas flap fully. The air that came in was warmer than expected, carrying with it the smell of dry earth, brittle grass, and something faintly animal. The lioness lifted her head. She didn't hesitate. She rose in a single motion, lean and steady, her shoulder brushing against the mat as she stepped forward. The cub followed, slower. His back legs wobbled once beneath him, but he caught himself. His body leaned into hers, not for support, but for reassurance. They paused at the threshold, the light outlining their bodies in the doorway. She looked back only once, then led the way into the open. No one moved to stop them. The rangers stood behind the wire, watching from a distance. No radios buzzed, no cameras clicked. They watched as the lioness moved into the grass, slow but certain, her body cutting a soft line through the brittle stalks. The cub stayed beside her, his steps hesitant but determined. His ears flicked often, reacting to every sound, wind through branches, birds overhead, the distant creak of dry roots beneath the earth. Still, he walked. Together they moved farther from the shelter, past the last edge of flattened dust, past the low stone outcroppings that marked the edge of the protected zone. The cub stumbled once, caught himself, then pressed forward again, his flank brushing her shoulder. The wind rose behind them, lifting their scent into the air, carrying it east, back toward the camp, back toward the humans who had waited and watched. Some reunions happen with sound, with cries or roars or urgent movement. This one happened in silence. The cub didn't call out. The lioness didn't growl. Their communication had been made long before the first step out of the shelter. It happened the moment she lay beside him, in the touch of her nose to his fur, in the slow stretch of his paw across her chest. That had been the only signal either of them needed. Lena watched until they reached the tall grass. By then, only their backs were visible, two tawny figures moving as one. The cub's tail flicked once. The lioness turned slightly, guiding him around a cluster of scrub thorns. She didn't stop to check if he could follow. She knew. By the time the sun touched the edge of the earth, they were no longer visible. Only the movement of the grass betrayed their path, the slow ripple of bodies pressing gently through a golden sea. Emil lowered the gate latch again, his hands slow. He didn't speak. No one did. The camp began to return to itself. Shadows crept in along the walls. The lanterns remained unlit. There was nothing left to do. Lena stayed a little longer. She walked to where the grass had parted, the soft prints of their paws barely holding in the dry soil. The wind had already begun to erase them. Still, she knelt and touched the ground once. It was warm. Not from the sun, but from the memory of what had passed through. Not every rescue ends with a return to health. Some end with a choice, with trust, with the quiet leaving of a shelter and the rejoining of a life interrupted. This one had not been about healing alone. It had been about waiting, listening, letting an animal decide when to leave and who to leave with. Two shadows had walked into the grass that evening. One, sure. One is still learning. But they had walked together. That was what mattered. Above, the wind shifted again. Dust curled along the path. A bird flew low across the sky, following the edge of the ridge, and far beyond the reach of the camp's final post, somewhere in the folds of tall grass, a lioness and her cub lay down for the night, side by side. The camp returned to silence.